So I'm going to start with Leslie and Jeff. So Leslie and Jeff represent people who bring in lots of data and put it together. And I want to sort of describe the problem, because we've talked a lot about this explosion of data. So what does that look like when you're trying to do your job? So Leslie, let's start with you.
From a GIO's perspective, our role is to build partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, be it with public entities or the private sector, to make the best available data available for decision making for our state, whether that's public safety, emergency response, economic development. It really doesn't matter what the application is, right? It's just building those partnerships to make that data readily available. In terms of problems and pain points, which I think is what I'm here to highlight, I see an enormous gap between data creators. There is a big gap between data creators and the end users. So I'll give you two examples. From a technical perspective, we're wasting enormous amount of resources conflating and integrating data on a project level. For states and state governments, public, federal, local, it's very expensive. We don't have the technical capabilities typically in-house to create sustainable conflation and integrated workflows. So that's the technical sort of gap. The non-technical gap that I see and that's increasing rapidly is that the decision makers that need this information to make decisions surrounding public safety or emergent response don't have a technical background and don't have technical staff. So how are you going to connect the decision makers to the information in an easy way, right? Not even here, the wildfires are a really good example of that, right? Where we have many of people in the room that provided this data public, remotely sensed imagery put to the public via download. For somebody who is trying to make real-time decisions on the ground, they don't have the time to download data. So how do we create a modeled infrastructure and system for which we can empower decision makers?
I'm going to tell a remarkably similar story because from Microsoft's perspective, I do have the talent and resources to bring in a bunch of data and buy it and conflate it. But what I'm tired of is spending more money conflating the data than actually getting the data, and significantly amount more money. And there's a lot to be said for having a common ID system, a common framework. Because you know what's easier than conflating data? ID join. Yes. It's cheap. And it's just as true for me coming from a big company as it is for a state or an organization or an NGO or a nonprofit. And that's it's not the only reason, but that's one of the big reasons why Microsoft is a believer and is part of Overture Maps Foundation and thinks that what we're doing here together as a collection of companies with mutual interests and entities and other organizations is really important.
We at Precisely, so the question we get a lot of the time is why would we join Precisely? Precisely is an open data broker, and Precisely is someone who sells data. We have a large data business. Overture is an open data project. We're commoditizing a lot of that base layer. But because that base layer can act as a common reference layer, it can provide IDs that make that column join possible. It's not going to eliminate conflation, but it's going to greatly reduce the number of times you have to do it, and more importantly, the number of times you have to do it when you have to share that data in a crisis. And I think there's two takeaways here. Is one, it helps all of us here collaborate and move faster and spend less time on things that really don't add value to our business. But the second thing is geospatial is still too damn hard. And when we can make it so all companies have to do is a column join, our addressable market increases by a factor. So for Precisely, that's incredibly important because the number of people I can sell geospatial data to that they can benefit from just gets so much bigger, which is why we care so much about Overture.
Yeah, I was going to emphasize, it's important to emphasize that open data doesn't mean all data is open and free. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, having a base layer that allows you to create this market for proprietary data, for richer data, for all kinds of things. Some of that may be open, some of that may be closed. The idea is the more you get on board with this, the more it actually expands the opportunity to bring in large players, small players, bring everyone together.
Yeah. Open data serves a role in the stack. It is not, the entire stack is not open. And so how are you sort of thinking about that as you're thinking about the technology part of it?
Yeah, I think there's two important things here. One is that as an open data project, we're not trying to put together the data set that everybody will use. We're trying to, as Drew said, put together a very high quality, open, reliable data set that is the foundation for interoperability. What we're trying to do is increase interoperability without sacrificing things like licensing. We don't have to worry about, okay, well, we don't have the data because that's not open, or that's proprietary, or this is commercial, or that doesn't fit our needs. And in fact, when you think about a referencing system where you can bring entities together, what we're really trying to say is all the available data that we have together to get the highest quality, but also meaning that now what you're saying is that this entity in this data set is equal to this entity in this data set is equal to this entity in this data set. You can keep your data as is. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to adopt somebody else's geometry or attributes, but you can easily link all that information together. And so I think that's the power of Overture, is that interoperability and that reduced conflation cost that we have been seeking for decades.
Digital twin is a pretty big word that can involve a lot of different things for different uses and applications. So maybe, Jeff or Leslie, when you think about different uses of map data, how does that spatial join help you kind of flex between whatever the needs are for that application?
I'd say for me, with the spatial join that Overture is building is the retention of the metadata within those value-added attributes, that ability to know, right? Because within government sometimes, if you have in law, to build, that you're responsible to build a certain data set, there may be that idea that it's a single source of information that really should be used across all our different aspects of decision making. But the value here in having multiple sources of information is having confidence bounds on your decisions, right? When you have multiple sources of information, you can more easily validate, and then you can actually provide more confidence bounds on those decisions that's being made. So those are the
I think
couple of benefits.
Brian, what was that? Bundle adjusting the world? There it is. Got that one. Yeah, I think what's really important, and why geospatial is special, and why Overture is so important in delivering that is, I compare this to Unix time, which is Unix time was this massive achievement that we had this format that we could store in a column, and we could dial it up or down to the hour, to the day, to the second, what have you, and we could join off of it, and we could aggregate off of it, and everyone could use it. In order to stand up the equivalent of Unix time to facilitate this collaboration and kind of Cambrian era of exchange, we have to have an open foundation of data that everyone can use to define a place, because place is just this special human knowledge structure.
It would seem if not all data is open, but some data maybe could be open, what's that either math or conversation inside a company that's a data provider to say, what can we collaborate on and put in the open, and what do we not want to collaborate on and not put in the open?
It's a really easy equation. What makes the market bigger? Everything is done to make the market bigger. And so at Precisely, we have this great product we're launching just this last week, which is a data graph API, where you can provide it one of our IDs. So we've created our own ID, but it's built on our data, and our data is not open. So not everyone has a Precisely ID, so they can't throw it into this API and then get any of 500 data elements back. To make the market bigger, we'll match our ID to GeoBuiz. We'll match our ID to plus codes. GeoBuiz is that magic ID within Overture, the global entity reference system. Every entity in the Overture database has a unique ID that we try our best to persist as long as possible. Anything that makes the market bigger, that's the equation you got to balance, what you open versus what you hold back.
If you think about bringing all this data together, particularly in just something as simple as a column join, what you're really saying is now I can look at 20 different aspects that all reference the same entity and look and say, hey, is this good quality data? Are they all telling me the same thing? Are they telling me different things? Are they telling me conflicting information? And how can I use that type of system to continue to improve quality?
And from a data seller perspective, I think, again, it reduces the conflation time, and it makes your data more attractive, because if you're keying your stuff off GeoBuiz, it's easier to sell to Microsoft, or easier to sell to Meta, or anyone who's in that AWS ecosystem, or not Overture ecosystem, because it makes the cost of onboarding the data so much cheaper, which, by the way, costs more than they pay to license the data. It is a tax on the entire industry that we are working to just chip away at.
When you need all this data to work together, you need it like right now. Like you have a counterpart somewhere in Southern California who's not having a good week, I suspect. But I mean, it really becomes something where you may not know what data you need, but you need to put it together in a very timely fashion, especially in an emergency situation.
Yeah, sure. From my perspective, when it does come to hazards and emergency response and how you make decisions surrounding that, that ability to have that time stamp, right, to go back in time, but also to go into the future, right, if we have this conflated ecosystem of information, then we're much more prepared, I guess, to make predictive decisions just as much as our ability to go back and look at change over time.
One of the big things is going to be the use of AI, and very often we think about the use of AI in extracting and making geospatial data available, but there's also a use of AI in creating data and generating data, and how open data fits into that.
We have transitioned to using a lot of AI, LLM type tools for better conflation, because it's still cheaper than armies of humans and crowdsourced stuff and all of this. But you know what's still cheaper than that? ID join. Yeah. And like this is, you know, I just emphasize how much of this is such a tax on our industry. All the great stuff we've heard about like, oh, let's join in the services layer, let's do all this stuff. You're doing that problem probably in your company, whether you realize it or not. You're like investing in conflation. And I think if you price that out and understand how important that is, that's what ends up bringing a lot of people to you know, together in this common interest. I would love to take a question from Brian.
As Jeff knows, you know, I spent a lot of time with conflation and IDs and ID forwarding. So you talked about you want to have an ID live as long as it possibly can, but at some point you're going to either lose it or it's going to die. Yeah. And if I have an ID, ID forwarding becomes an issue. That's question one. Question two is, you know, if I have a business or a river or a building, they all change at different rates. Rivers actually change, the meanders are kind of scary. And businesses change at 10 to 20% a year, and buildings change sporadically. And if I have an ID association between a business and a building, that seems pretty important, but one changes more frequently than the other, and the menu can only be attached to the business.
I think this was a big insight at the beginning, which is persistence is the goal, but traceability is a requirement. And it's going to be different for each layer. It's going to be different for each theme, given exactly what you said. Having change logs of deletions, additions are going to have to accompany releases eventually.
One of the big words has been collaboration, and it just struck me that it's a lot easier to raise your hand and say, yeah, we'll collaborate, than actually do it. Do you have any last thoughts of what does it take to make this work?
So to me, I think what is important for collaboration is coming to the table and rolling up your sleeves and having the conversation first, and then actually engaging. I think a lot of times we talk about collaboration and we say, okay, let's talk about it, we have a discussion, and then we all go our separate ways. I mean, it happens over and over. You know, these kind of events, we do that too. Come to the table, come help solve the problem. I guarantee you that if we all solve this together, it's exactly like Drew said, it's going to make the market bigger. There is a value for everybody in this room, for all your companies, across all sectors. This is a challenge that we've been dealing with, you know, certainly my entire career, and I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm sure everybody feels this pain. So it's time to put this particular problem to bed and move on to the real challenges, the things that we want to solve that are really innovative and move the technology forward. Let's put this one to bed.
We're a minute over. Thanks very much for your patience, and thank you to the panel.